any special one may have for evening service. If not, we ended this morning in Hebrews 11, so let's pick up in Hebrews 11 for this evening. Because as we looked at this morning, do you believe? And hopefully realizing that if you do, it's your actions and your words that go hand in hand together, that you say what you believe and you do what you believe. And when you tell someone what you believe, that they look at your life and they say, yeah, I see that. The reason people are called hypocrites, the reason Christ called the scribes and the Pharisees hypocrites is because they said one thing, but their actions didn't back that up. They were pretending to be something else. And the reason a lot of people refer to Christians and church people as hypocrites today is because they hear us say things, they see us go to church, but then they see our daily actions as well. They pay attention to our Tuesdays and Thursdays just like they do our Sundays and Wednesdays. And they see a contrast and a contradiction between what we say and what we do. Not only does the world look at us and pay attention to it, God looks at us, God listens to us, and then God challenges us. Because when we tell God, I believe you, God, when He asks, believe ye that I'm able to do this? And when He asks, whom do ye say that I am? And when He asks things, when He asks us, do you believe me? Do you trust me? Do you have confidence in me, Jared, to see you through this? Do you have confidence? You need to rely upon me. Do you trust me? And as God asks me questions and I say, yea, Lord, I'm willing to follow you to death. And yea, Lord, I'm willing to stand strong with you. Yea, Lord, I'm willing to stand though others may fall. I'll never betray you. And I have the same attitude as Peter did, and don't we all? Don't you sometimes kind of have the attitude of Peter? Not me. I'm not going to forsake Jesus. I'm not going to stop coming to church. I don't care what happens or they say. I'm not going to fall away no matter what happens. I'm not going to be betrayed by God no matter what happens. And when Peter stood firm and said, yea, Lord, I'm ready to follow you to death, what happened hours later? He was put to the test. And God puts us to test as well. And in Hebrews 11, verse 37, as we're wrapping up this faith hero chapter, verse 37 of Hebrews 11 reads like this, where it says, they were stoned, they were sawn asunder, were tempted, were slain with the sword. They wandered about in sheepskin and goatskins, being destitute, afflicted, and tormented, of whom the world was not worthy. We wandered in deserts and in mountains and in dens and caves of the earth. And these all, having obtained a good report through faith, receiving not the promises, God having provided some better thing for us, that they without us should not be made perfect. Now verse 37 reads, some were stoned. We may not be stoned today. It's not a practice that our government or our nation or our community, it's not a practice that is observed, so we may never be stoned. Probably when we saw asunder, unfortunately, it still happens, and it has happened in our community in the last recent months. There has been dismembered bodies that have done, so it still happens. It just prayerfully won't happen to us. Tempted, though, is something that each and every one of us are going to be done. We are going to be tempted. And we're going to be tempted by Satan trying to drag us away. And sometimes Satan tests us. Well, you're as strong as you think you are. But every time that Satan does test us, he's allowed to by God. So sometimes it's Satan's desire to tempt us that God allows it to happen. And sometimes, when it's not evil, God never tempts us with evil. But yet there are times that God will put us in a position where God will test us. God will test me. Again, He will never tempt me to fall, but He will test my faith and my strength. He will never tempt me to commit a sin. He'll allow Satan to do that. But there are times God will test my resolve. God will test me whether if I'm going to be diligent in my daily studies. He will allow something to be in the way. He will allow my finances to get rough to see if I'm going to be faithful to my tithing. He will allow me to follow through if I tell somebody, and it's a very careful thing we all do a lot of times. And about like when you say hi, it's kind of a challenge to ourselves right now. I intentionally didn't look at Mike when I went over there to sit down because I reach out and shake hands You know, it's like an emotion. And we want to shake hands. You want to say hi. You want to do things. How you doing? Well, I'm doing good. And you want to shake hands. You want to do things. And another statement you'll say on a regular basis is, if you need anything, call me. Or let me know. Or if I can do anything for you, just let me know. And sometimes God will just let someone test me. When you say you'll be there for someone, so here's your chance. And there's all kinds of things that can come out of this. There's all kinds of a direction to look at, as was already shared about the tornado. You hear about we all know about the tornado in Jonesboro. As bad as the social separation would be, and as bad as it was, as many people was wounded and hurt, if we wasn't in the middle of a COVID-19 social distancing, that would have been a different experience, wouldn't it? The time of day it hit, and when it hit, and where it hit, there would have been extremely more people there. So it was just a small thing. Everyone says, I'll help you. Everyone says, if you need me, let me know. Right now, we're going to be coming upon a time of testing that, aren't we? We're going to have family members, we're going to have community members, we're going to have church members in need. What are we going to do about it? In the past, we've been there and helped, but when it hits on a different level, do you mean it? So again, God, this is one of the ways God can tempt, isn't it? And test. He'll never tempt us to commit his sin, but he will test our resolve and our faithfulness to him. Are you going to be as dedicated as you said? Go to Job just for a little bit, just as a reminder. As I made those statements, we all nodded our head. We all agreed. We know what I was referring to. But God will not tempt us with evil. He will not tempt us to commit a sin. We do that on our own. He just gives us a little bit free rein. He gives us an opportunity to make a choice. And then it is always ours. Here, Satan, though, he impacts Job's life. Even coming down to the illness, as we get into it with the boils and his sickness and his life, and it was all in God's hands of what he could and couldn't touch. But this hedge, and we read about the hedge a few services ago, as we started this pandemic temptation. I guess temptation is not the right word, but trial is better. But in Job 1 and 8, we've read most of this chapter then, so I'm going to pull this verse out now. The Lord said unto Satan, Hast thou considered my servant Job? There is none like him in the earth, a perfect and an upright man, one that feareth God and escheweth evil. Then Satan answered the Lord and said, Doth Job fear God for naught? Hast thou not made a hedge about him and about his house, and about all that he hath on every side? Thou hast blessed the work of his hands, and his substance is increased in the land. But put forth thine hand now, and touch all that he hath, and he will accuse thee to thy face. And the Lord said unto Satan, Behold, all that he hath is in thy power, only upon himself. Put not forth thine hand. So Satan went forth from the presence of the Lord. Now we all know that this pandemic we have, we know this virus, this disease, we know it started in Wuhan, China. So they're telling us. Why do we know that? Because if you want to find the solution, we'll get the ultimate answer, you can go find the root. Where did it start at? You want to fix the problem, ultimately you want to go back to where's it start. Follow the connections back and find out where it started. And ultimately, this situation of Job, if you trace it all back, losing his children, losing all that he had, getting the boils and getting down, ultimately everything that Job experienced, when you trace it back to the very core root, the very initial beginning of what set everything in motion, what was it? Job was an upright man. It wasn't even that Satan showed up and asked permission. Satan didn't bring up Job. Who brought up Job? God brought up Job. Why did God bring up Job? Because he knew the ultimate outcome. He knew how it would play out. Not only did he know how it would play out, all things work together for our good. Romans 8:28, the passage we love to get comfort and strength from. And we try to point out many times that this is a reference to our spiritual good and not our fleshly good. Amen? When we take the entire book of Job as a whole, even though Job was a perfect upright man, Job needed to learn a little bit of lesson. Because Job ends up, we think so much about this showed up Satan showed up at this day, and he's roaming to and fro, and God brought up Job because Job was a perfect upright man. But yet God also knew that he needed to have a conversation with Job of where was you when I framed the heavens and the earth? Where was you when I did this? We know the conversation that God and Job had later on. Because all the possessions that Job had, all the loss that Job had, all the pain that Job went through, the victories that Job had for a while, the friends that showed up, and their lessons they're going to do, when you finish the book of Job, at the very end of it, not only does Job gain everything back plus physically, and sometimes we like to read that. Sometimes we like to read this, and we like to flip over the last chapter and read that the final end with Job was better than the beginning, right? Why? Because Job now has seen God with his eyes. I've heard you, but now I've seen you. Job's relationship with God was closer at the end than the beginning. But not only Job's. Job had some pretty good friends, Brother Gary referred to this morning even. They showed up and sat there. But at the end of the book, even they're closer to God, aren't they? This whole experience impacted Job and his friends' spiritual well-being. So everything was, but it was a temptation. And Job was a perfect, read verse 8. Hast thou considered my servant Job, that there is none like him in earth, a perfect or a complete, and an upright man that feareth God and escheweth evil? He done that, but he ends up with a personal relationship with God, with a personal experience. God knew that he needed. So even God knew what Job was, but God gave Job an opportunity to prove it, and then he gave an opportunity to learn a little more. So go back to the real root of it and take away the physical aspects and focus on the spiritual, and the end of Job worked out good. Romans 8:28 can apply to Job in the aspect of he spiritually was closer to God. So Job was put in a position of trial and of persecution to some degree because his friends ended up coming down hard on him. But all that Job went through was not because he was an evil man. Brother Mike phrased a question up here that we all have asked. I have asked it. I'm ashamed to say I've asked it, but I've asked it. Why do good things happen, bad things? You know, why do bad things happen to good people? I've asked it, both things in my life and seeing things happen to loved ones. I've asked that question and struggled with that, as others have. But bad things happen to good people all the time. And the ultimate answer is for us to get closer to God. Because they need to learn something. Job experienced worse than I've ever experienced. Or I don't know nobody that has experienced everything to the degree Job did. And he started off as a good man and he ended even better. So we need to see the trials that we are brought our way as an opportunity. It's going to get, it's going to get worse than my flesh has ever seen. And in the end time, whether we're there or not, I personally don't think we are. My personal thoughts don't matter for nothing, do they? Scripture is what it is. But we say all the time, if you need me, let me know. I'm there for you, I'll help, or I'll focus on God. We say a lot of stuff. A lot of our idle comments are going to be put to the test. Are we willing to back them up? Are we willing to focus on the only thing important is our relationship with God? Are we willing to focus on the relationship with one another? Are we willing to set aside the sin that does so easily beset us? Are we willing to humble ourselves and say, hey, I'm sorry. I'm a different person now through this than I was when I started. I'm sorry for things I've done. Are we willing to humble ourselves not before God, but before each other as well? Are we humble? Are we willing to allow this test to improve our lives? Because we read about Job so much, the patience of Job, and all the things Job went through, but let's also realize Job learned a lesson. Are we willing to learn a lesson? Go to Luke 4. I think it's a difficult thing when I choose to start a diet and then we have a big potluck. When I choose, we have our monthly, potluck fellowship dinners, and I choose to start a diet. It's just temptation. It's just too tempting for me, and I fail and I falter, and when I come in contact with something I'm trying to quit, I have endured a lot of temptations in my life, and I've fallen more than I've stood through. But I don't think I can relate to the 40 days that Christ went through. Can you? Christ had 40 days of direct temptation, of direct conversation, of direct interaction with Satan for 40 days and 40 nights, not eating, being tempted in all these ways. And we looked at one here a while back about, the throwing himself off the temple, and he responded always with, "It is written." But again, chasing things back to the root, why did it all start? What took Jesus to the mount? Go to Luke 4:1. And Jesus, being full of the Holy Ghost, returned from Jordan and was led by the Spirit into the wilderness, being 40 days tempted of the devil, and in those days he did eat nothing, and when they were ended, he afterward hungered. Jesus had given his life. He came to set the example. He came to live for us. He fulfilled all responsibilities in the flesh he had to fulfill. He served his time, and now as we enter into the baptism of Christ, right after the baptism, right after the voice said, "This is my beloved Son, in whom I'm well pleased," right after the dove descended upon him, the Spirit descended upon him like a dove, and after that is when he is led off in the wilderness to be tempted, right? He's baptized. He begins his walk, and he's tempted. And when he comes back from the mount of temptation, what does he immediately do? He begins his ministry. That's the Sermon on the Mount. And he begins preaching. As immediately after the baptism and prior to preaching, he was led away. If we say, "God, I'm ready to do something for you, and I'm going to do here's why you're here, I'm ready to do it," we're going to be tempted. Are you really ready? Are you really ready to go do it? This is kind of like in our world today when someone goes off and they get an education in something. Before they graduate from it, there's an accepted final. Usually a final proving, a final testing. We don't like final tests when you're in school, and college students don't like it. We don't like the whole testing. But what is the whole point of a final test in an education situation? What's the point of a final test? To prove that you have obtained the knowledge needed to do what you've just been taught. And our experience on earth is just a trial run to spend eternity with God. And as we go into the ministry, whether it's as a pastor or whether it is as just as a child of God that's going to witness to your neighbors and families and friends, everything we do, the next step is always going to be preceded by test. We're going to be tempted regularly, and we're being tempted, and sometimes we see the test. Sometimes we see the temptation. Right now, it's going to be very obvious that we are going to be tempted. Our faith is going to be tempted. And I pray now that we're acknowledging we will stand and maybe do a little better job than we have the others. But you're constantly tested and tempted. How are you going to stand? We need to be willing to prove to God. And don't think it a bad thing. I can't believe I'm having to go through this. It should be an honor to show God how important He is to us. What is it we try to relate all the time? The only thing important is our relationship with God. Amen? What a joy it should be to prove that. We say it, but what a joy it should be to be able to prove God is the only thing important to me. Hebrews 4, and as I said, as Jesus entered His ministry, He spent 40 days, 49 tempted. But over here in Hebrews 4, we find a point that we must really realize. I don't know the experience that we all have had. I have been given tests before, occupational and college and other times I've been given tests before that there was no way to pass. There was no way to pass. The point was to prove to you that you didn't know it, you did this, or to see how you would interact, see how you would handle the fail, see if what you could pick the best choice out of the best wrong choice or whatever. There's this mentality they may have. I don't know if you've ever experienced a test that's unpassable, but I have, and they're no fun. But I want us to know up front now, our life is not a test that is not passable, because Christ came and did it perfectly. And then He sent His Spirit to come back with us. Everything that we come in, every temptation that I have repeatedly faced and fallen, and unfortunately I confess there are those things. There are situations in my life that I have repeatedly come in contact with, and I've repeatedly got wrong. I've repeatedly fallen flat on my nose and did the wrong thing. And it's the sin that does so easily beset me. It's the thorn in my flesh that's there to keep me humble. There's all these things to look at, but reality speaking, I only fall because I don't pay attention to God. I don't use Him. I can pass every test in my way if I go to Christ first and rely upon Him completely. This may get bad around here for us, but we can survive and thrive and come out closer to God in the end if we rely upon Him. So in Hebrews 4 and verse 14, seeing then that we have a great high priest that is passed into the heavens, Jesus the Son of God, let us hold fast our profession. For we have not a high priest which cannot be touched with the feelings of our infirmities, but was in all points tempted like as we are, yet without sin. Let us therefore come boldly unto the throne of grace, that we may obtain mercy and find grace to help in time of need. But 15, but Christ, we know He's referring to, was in all points tempted like as we are, yet without sin. So, everything I come in contact with, I can pass. Every temptation that comes my way, I can pass. Sometimes I can go so far on my own, so good. Job made it a ways through there on his own pretty good. But he ultimately ended up having to have a conversation with God, didn't he? He had to learn a lesson, he needed God. He did a good start. He was a perfect, upright man, avoided the evil, skewed evil. He had it. And he did good for a while, even though his wife was telling him, go ahead and curse God and die. He did good for a while, but he reached a point when his friends showed up, and they started riding on him. He reached a point, he was only good for so far, and then he needed help. And my good for so far isn't even close to Job's good for so far. My good for so far is in a negative distance. I'm not good at all without God. But I need to be reminded of that and know it. And if a test I fail reminds me that I need to rely upon God, and I do, that's the victory. That was the point of it to begin with. But he was tempted in all points like we are. So don't ever end up trying to look for the lesser of two evils. And that's a human flesh. If you think you're presented with a problem that there is no good answer to, that you just have to pick the lesser of two evils, then we really are falling short, because Jesus never picked the lesser of two evils. Jesus picked the right answer every time. There is the right answer there. Unfortunately, and sometimes I'm not wise enough to know it. If I'm picking the lesser of two evils, then I need to pray more, because the right answer is there. The right answer is with Christ. And 1 Corinthians 10, excuse me. Not only was Christ tempted in all points, yet without sin, all of my brethren are tempted as I am, and sometimes I just don't share with you my temptations because I was shamefully fallen. I regrettably was too weak to hold up, and I don't always share all my weaknesses. But I believe that we all have that problem a little bit too. We don't always share our weaknesses. We don't always share our mistakes, partly because we're ashamed of them, partly because we just don't want to admit we made a mistake, partly we don't want everyone to know our secret lives. But if we put all cards on the table, if we was all bold enough and brave enough to go ahead and just lay out all of our cards on the table, I believe we'd find we deal with the same issues more than we think we do. We all end up struggling with a lot of the same things, and with whether anxiety, whether it's depression, whether it's haughty arrogancy, whether it's a grudge, unforgiveness. We can have all these things, but ultimately I want us to realize if we could just be bold enough to lay all of our cards open for our brethren, we will see that we all deal with the same things more than we think we do. That's why 1 Corinthians 10 and 13 says this: "There hath no temptation taken you, but such as is common to man. But God is faithful, who will not suffer you to be tempted above that ye are able, but will with the temptation also make a way of escape, that you may be able to bear it." It doesn't say you're going to win. It's not going to come out your way. You know, Job was praying, "If so be my children may have sinned." He didn't know, but just in case, he was loving them and praying for them enough. Job would have rather not had his children's life taken away. Job probably would have rather not had all of his possessions taken away. Job probably would have rather not sit in boils and all these things, but yet he still didn't curse God through them. He got closer in the end. But his win was he was closer to God. And we may not end up coming out victorious in a position. It may not come out our way. Our main names may not go in light as a victor in the battle. But we will be able to bear our way through as long as we rely upon Christ. And that's the bigger lesson. It's so easy to get caught up and fight a physical battle when then if you chase it back to the root, there is a spiritual battle at play. And this virus may be coming through, and it may affect us economically, it may affect us physically, it may affect us in many ways, but it's also going to affect us spiritually. As Brother Gary's words of encouragement and warning was a while ago, let's be prepared to focus on that and not allow us. Because I support social distancing right now, I do, because I believe in the contingency of this virus, but I 100% acknowledge Brother Gary's words of warning that staying away for no matter reason, what reason, can bring callous, can bring cold, can bring separation, it can lead into a bigger issue. So we need to safeguard that, be praying for that, and taking every measure possible as led by the Spirit to be sure that it doesn't affect us spiritually. Economically, we can overcome. Physically, if you don't overcome, as Brother Gary shared, you really win anyway then. If you go home and be with the Lord physically, the family left behind are the ones that really suffer. But all of those things we focus on, let's don't forget the spiritual. Because it can make us more negative, it can bring forth fear. As one of the things I need to be reminded of most of my life, when I get full of anxiety and worry, that are signs of fear, and there is no fear in love. And there is no fear in faith. If I trust in God completely, my fear and my anxiety will go away. So the fear of the possibilities can lead us astray. There's so many spiritual things that can pop up. So don't let it take us away, but let's allow the opportunity. No matter how strong you are, is anyone here prepared to say they were as good as Job? In the beginning of the book. In the beginning of the book, when Satan appeared before God and he said, "What are you doing?" He said, "Roaming to and fro." And when he said, "Have you considered my servant Job?" I am not a whit to that Job that started the book of Job. Yet, he had a lesson to learn. So, whatever may come the next few days or months through this deal, I am confident if I acknowledge this as a spiritual test, I can learn a lesson and be drawn closer to God. Amen? So that should be our goal. To acknowledge the test that is before us. And this test isn't whether we are financially able to survive, whether we are physically healthy, able to resist the virus. The true test is, are we able to draw closer to God through this? As we prepare for the verse of the song,